For our newcomers, welcome to the webinar, KYC and Safer Gambling, Tackling Fraud with Technology. My name is Maarten Haijer. I'm from the EGBA and I'll be moderating this session today with you. We'll be discussing a number of topics, but first I will introduce you to the panelists. Eleni Panagiotopoulou from Softswiss, then Fredrik Eggen from Kindred, and Kris Galloway from Sumsub. They're your speakers, and they will participate in the discussion. At the end, as I said, you can ask questions to the panelists and also to me if you want to as well. Now, for the first, the topics to discuss, as I said, why is KYC the key to safer gambling? And safer gambling, we include obviously also fraud prevention. So we'll have some real-life cases around fraud attempts and KYC challenges. The latest in technology, from biometrics to AI, and what will be next, so best practices and trends. And you have the opportunity, as I said, via the Q&A to raise any topic you would want to discuss as well. But we first start off with the importance of KYC and safer gambling, and to kick us off there, I'll ask Eleni to give a short presentation on why KYC is the key to safer gambling. So Eleni, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Maarten. And thank you everyone for joining today. So I'm going to talk a bit about why KYC is the key to safer gambling and explain what kind of areas KYC can be used in to ensure a safer environment for gambling for everyone. So first of all, KYC plays a critical role in reducing the likelihood of underage gambling. By verifying the customers or the players' identity and age, we can ensure that only eligible individuals can gain access to gambling services. And this is very important to help protect vulnerable populations. Now, this is kind of the obvious one. And so the next one is about facilitating the detection of patterns indicative of money laundering. So through robust identity verification and ongoing monitoring, we can spot suspicious activity, we can spot spikes in activity, we can spot suspicious patterns, unusual deposits, unusual withdrawals, and take proactive steps to address any potential threats. It also fosters responsible gaming by identifying at-risk behaviors. So we can use KYC to analyze customer data, we can detect early warning signs of problem gambling and intervene with tailored support, with restrictions, with limits to try and safeguard player well-being. The next point that's very important to me because I'm more interested and more involved in AML, in anti-money laundering, is that effective KYC practices support AML reporting obligations to the regulators, to regulatory authorities. So by collecting and keeping and maintaining accurate customer data, it makes our job easier when we have to submit reports where we have to submit data or questionnaires to the regulator and try and contribute to the broader fight against financial crime. So these types of statistics, reports, data that we give the regulator, it's important that it remains accurate by verifying them through KYC. It also is quite important to build trust and transparency between operators and players. When players know that their identity and funds are secure, they feel more confident with engaging with the platform. This is actually quite a common thing for players to check when getting onboarded, and actually they notice when an operator is being too lenient, and so they tend to lose their trust over that operator, thinking that if they can bypass the KYC rules, maybe they can also bypass the paying out rules or safe gambling rules. So it really enhances the overall integrity of gambling operations and the financial system to ensure that we as operators are seen as responsible and credible participants in the industry, but also create kind of for us it helps us create comprehensive player profiles to assess customer risk. So when trying to understand the player and kind of tailor our due diligence measures against the player, it really helps to have good KYC to set appropriate rules, appropriate limits, ensure a balanced relationship between player enjoyment and safety. So, in essence, KYC is much more than just a compliance requirement. We like to see it more as the foundation of a safer, more trustworthy, and more sustainable gambling ecosystem.
Thank you very much, Eleni. So that's a pretty comprehensive overview of the importance of KYC for a lot of the operations of gambling operators. Clearly, it has very much evolved over time from, let's say, simple verifying of identity to a critical component, as you said, of fraud detection, prevention, and importantly as well, safer gambling and creating a safer gambling environment. It has developed really significantly. Maybe Kris, you from Sumsub, but also experienced before as an operator. How has this taken place, and what are, let's say, the critical elements of that development?
Oh, I think it's gone from being something that was very much a static identity check to something that's evolved over time into being a little bit more dynamic, which has then evolved to incorporate more features. I think I just noticed Piotr Lisak in the chat just mentioned liveness, for example. I think that's another great example as to how additional functionality has come in to aid the overall process, to becoming almost algorithmic and looking forward to the point where it's going to become AI driven to a degree as well. So I think just the changes that we've seen over the last decade have been revolutionary.
And Fredrik, from your perspective as an operator?
Yeah, I think there are two main things to highlight. One is obviously the regulatory environment has changed. Like let's say, it imposes a lot more verification than it used to. And then you have the technology has thankfully also improved. So you don't rely purely on manual documents. You can use more frictionless solutions.
And just to come back to that as well, I think the other thing I think that also has an impact, I guess, is regulatory requirements and regulation in the different countries that you operate in, because there are limits and requirements on the different laws that you have to take into account as well. So has that been going in parallel, or are there big differences between requirements that you need to comply with? Maybe Eleni, if you could say something about that.
Yeah, so I think it's important to remember that in the past couple of decades, things have changed a lot. And initially, KYC was viewed more like a checkbox that you're supposed to tick while onboarding, meet regulatory requirements, and then forget about it. But today, I think it has transformed into a tool that we can use in many ways, to fraud detection, to AML investigations, fraud prevention. And the more modern KYC processes are becoming, then it's becoming no longer just about collecting identity documents. They're more about building a risk profile of the player, understanding the player. And if we add to the mix advanced technologies like AI and machine learning that I'm sure we're going to talk about a bit more later, we can also analyze behavioral patterns, detect anomalies. So in terms of creating a safer gambling environment, for example, effective KYC enables us to support responsible gambling initiatives. We can identify players who are more at risk through their spending patterns, gaming behavior, stuff like that we talked about. And that puts us in a position that we can intervene proactively. Whether it's providing resources, imposing limits, suspending accounts?
I think just going back to what you said in regards to the trust and how enhanced KYC enhances trust as well. I'd like to think that it all, in a way, and at some point in future, will all tie into the same solution in terms of KYC, in terms of AML, in terms of responsible gambling as well, and hopefully creates an ecosystem which players can trust, as opposed to some of the less regulated ecosystems out there, which make the onboarding process almost a little bit too simple. I mean, and this could tie into your CPA as well, right? And your overall metrics and your marketing attribution. And I feel we're I think the historians of the future, as far as iGaming is concerned, are going to look back on this and think to themselves, but why did they take so long? Why didn't it just click for them? Why didn't they just bring everything together in one place at the same time? Which I find quite interesting based on what you said there, Eleni.
Yeah, and maybe from let's say from the inside the operator point of view, I think there's, you look at this, Eleni, from an AML perspective, but there's the safer gambling people that are different than, I guess, the people that you work with on a daily basis. So how is the information sharing between the different parts of the within the company going? Is that something that is easily managed? Does it require new ways of working together? Does it add benefits to what you do? And the same goes for Fredrik, although I think Fredrik seems to be offline for the moment, but I'm very curious to hear from Fredrik as well how the extensive role of KYC actually also impacts the way that you function as an entity internally.
Yeah, and we actually have some people from our responsible gambling unit from Softswiss in the audience here. I've seen them, and they can confirm as well that we do work quite closely together. In many cases, responsible gambling and AML have the same goal, right? We are both interested in enhanced due diligence of high-risk players, and high-risk activity is really, really similar when it comes to at-risk problem gambling behaviors and anti-money laundering behaviors. Usually it's erratic spending, high volumes of deposits, very high velocity of transactions. So we do share kind of the same rules. We do share alerts, and we do share our enhanced due diligence process. So we try to create a standardized environment where we use kind of the same resources, the same verification rules, so that it's not confusing to the player, first of all, and so that we don't also duplicate requests. So it's kind of a logistical approach, but at the same time, it works well for us because we help each other and we don't have to do twice the work that needs to be done.
So it streamlined your internal processes as well. Fredrik, could you, from your point of view, could you say something about that as well?
I'm really sorry. I was disconnected just as I started answering your first questions. I don't even know if you heard that. So I just got back online. Can you hear me first?
No, I can hear you.
Okay, that's good.
Now, my question also to Eleni, but I'm also curious to hear from you, is how, because KYC is now much more broader than just initial identification, but it plays a role in many different parts of the operations, and therefore also many different colleagues in different units and departments, even probably at different places around Europe. I mean, how has it impacted your functioning internally? Does it make a big difference? Has it helped you?
I would say, yeah. I mean, you touch on maybe an important distinction. You know, when we talk about KYC, that can mean a lot of things. It is the identity, it is the address, it can be the payment method, but increasingly, it's also, you know, source of wealth, source of funds type of documentation. So, there's obviously regulatory, let's say, pressure that drives a lot of this, but thankfully, technology has caught up. I think if we were still, you know, exclusively dealing with manual documents, it would have been a nightmare, both operationally and for the customer. So how has it helped? Well, we are able to through using technology. It's very market dependent. Some countries are maybe further ahead. Some banks are maybe further ahead than others. But increasingly, it's sort of frictionless. So, and that means also less work for our operational teams. So that has helped us quite a bit. And then you end up with a customer base, even on the pure sort of ID verification side, that you can at the very least have some trust that it's that customer and that they live where they say they live, and so on. So there is a de-risking element to it. And I know that you can get around it, but it does at least provide a bit more of a healthy starting point from a customer base and customer management perspective.
I think
So
also
far,
just to, I was going to say, to chime in as well on this. It's interesting to see. I mean, Fredrik mentioned banking a moment ago. It's interesting to see how seriously different licenses take different industries, whether it's banking or crypto or iGaming. There can be varying levels of focus from one to another. But having worked for a few different operators, I think that one of the key elements is, and I'm sure we'll probably touch on this more later on, is making sure that there's open communication between the regulator and between the businesses or the operators, putting these into effect. I mean, I think if we look at the biggest example of this is happening at the moment with Brazil, at Sumsub, we're doing a lot of work in preparing for the Brazilian market and making sure that everything is in place. And so often having that level of communication with an operator is absolutely fundamental, because a lot of people don't necessarily understand gaming and iGaming at the level at which they need to in order to set up the appropriate KYC checks. They might look at something like banking and go, right, let's copy and paste that particular template. And it's rarely the case. It's rarely relevant. And I think that needs to be a two-way communication between the leading operators and the regulators. But that's absolutely fundamental, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's also, I think it also touched on something that is becoming increasingly important, or at least a question around whether data sharing amongst operators would help you perform KYC and safer gambling measures. So far, we really discussed knowing your own customers and your internal processes. But one way of potentially enhancing the KYC is to be able to share information across operators around individuals. Is that something that is happening, or is that too much a privacy issue, or is that limited by regulation? Is there any jurisdictions where you say this is more possible or not? And what is your experience with data sharing, or is it still very much focused on the information that you get as an individual operator and that you use for your internal processes? Has anyone any experience around this?
So from my side, I think it's one of those things, data sharing among operators, that sounds very good in theory. But in practice, I have not seen it happen, at least with direct communication between operators. What usually happens in most jurisdictions that I've had experience with is that we share data with the regulator, and that the regulator is responsible for communicating any suspicions or any information to the rest of the industry. But I think this is a very good opportunity for regulators and the industry to work together by enabling kind of secure and regulated data sharing frameworks, so we can create a more holistic view of a player's behavior.
Yeah.
And thankfully, advancements in technology maybe can make that a bit more viable in the future.
Yeah, Maarten, just one very quick thing to add, because I know that we need to move on to Fredrik's slide in regards to the Netherlands with the use case. I think that this is something which it almost feels on one hand like it's an open goal for so many operators to share this and solve something like arbitrage, for example, which becomes very difficult because you only have access to one data set as opposed to the data set of all the operators involved. I almost worry, though, that because the cards are played so close to the chest in this case, it's going to take something like AI to come along to really challenge that standard of not sharing data and almost make it dangerous not to, in order for us to move into an environment where that becomes standard as opposed to not.
Yeah, no, I think we'll touch on AI, but it's a fair point. Personally, I see the issues around sharing of data are still significant in many jurisdictions. So maybe AI will make a difference, but we'll see. But yeah, let's move on to the next topic, and it's how in the future KYC will be evolving as an ongoing process rather than as a onboarding focused event where it allows the operator to do many more regular checks, but also at the same time making the sign-up process slightly more user-friendly. So how do you find that? And I think Fredrik will have a user case example. So Fredrik, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is, I think it's an example that shows how compliance can have some maybe unexpected, maybe commercial and customer benefits and operational ones. So this is a few years ago, of course, but when the Netherlands re-regulated, there was a set of regulations around KYC. Not only did you need to verify the customer's identity, but the first deposit had to come from a bank account, no other method, and that bank account has to be in the customer's name. So there are some, let's say, manual ways of doing that, which involve obviously documents, and that's extremely labor intensive. What we did was convert this into a particularly frictionless solution where you get the name from the bank, you run a check when the deposit attempt happens, and if the details that you get don't match what is registered, the deposit just fails. So in essence, you have ensured that the money is not just that, let's say someone can always, steal or fake an identity, but it is a lot more difficult to get access to the same person's bank account. If you have confidence that the payment is coming from that user, then that practically eliminates a lot of risk. Equally, if you can make sure that that bank account is used to withdraw, you've covered another angle. So what we found is that we saw on the safer gambling side, circumventions of underage customers, self-excluded customers, customers who have hit a limit, whatever the case may be. It really just dropped off a cliff. We also were able to automate a lot more withdrawals because any sort of AML or fraud-related issues that, like a lot of them anyways, they tend to be around or a significant risk factor is the withdrawal method, or that making sure that the money is coming from and going to, especially the correct person, that it's not, for example, a stolen wallet or something like this. So, and then obviously later on in the journey, also from an AML de-risking perspective, you avoid having to get bank statements or anything else to verify the identity or the ownership of the payment method. You've already done it. So, and it improved customer satisfaction as well. So it's one of these examples that maybe on paper was a pretty strict, stringent requirement, but because we were able to turn it into a really good and frictionless solution, it actually worked out. It worked out really well. So a few pointers, if anyone is interested in, let's say, exploring this for themselves in their organization. So I keep mentioning the word frictionless. I think that's really key. A really important part of doing that is trying to avoid like documentation, interaction with customers. Ideally, the customer doesn't even know this check is happening. In order to achieve that, you do initially need like internal alignment, because this is something that might, let's say, internally, you might get pushback from the commercial teams who might be worried about drop off in deposits or something like this. So it's helpful to have some good arguments in place. I hope I provided a few. Obviously, you need any providers to actually be ready for this, any payment providers to be ready and actually give you the data that you need. This is subject to getting some KYC from the bank or the provider. And then the final thing is the data quality might not always be very good. It might not be in the same format as you have in your organization. So you're gonna, like a critical ingredient to making this successful is to making sure that you're accurately assessing automatically whether or not this is the same customer or someone else. If you think about all of the various ways you can write a name with special characters and multiple first names, multiple last names, and the list goes on. This is a challenge that I would take seriously, at least. So that is, that's basically the summary of that slide.
Thanks, Fredrik. I think very useful. And very useful also for the audience. We need to move on, but I had one quick question. Obviously, user experience, seamless, is all done to make sure that the customers don't drop off. Do you have ways of measuring whether customers drop off and at what points, or is that data that you gather and that you're able to use to measure your effectiveness in improving user experience?
Yeah, so what it's going to come down to with something like this is the rate of rejected deposits. You have to have a deposit attempt, right? And then you get the data. So how many of those are actually rejected? Then that can technically be quite a high percentage if a lot of them or most of them should be rejected. In other words, it is actually someone else trying to make that deposit. If you're clear about that's not something you want, you do not want a potential underage or a potential self-excluding customer or potential AML or whatever it might be. If you don't want that, then it's basically down to the accuracy of the detection system. If you have a unique code, as you might have in some markets, and you might get from payment providers, like in Sweden, you might get the SSN, for example. That's like literally just a perfect unique code that will always give you an accurate result, right? If you just get the name, first name, last name, and that's it, now there's a lot more room for error. Yeah? So it basically has to do with the accuracy of the logic, not necessarily how many deposits you're missing out on, because a lot of them are probably shouldn't have gone through anyway.
Yeah, the benchmark is very important, and what your objective is. That's very clear also from what you say. Obviously, you don't want to have any minors playing on your website. So I think, sorry for that, Fred, I think we could talk about it much longer, but we need to move on, and we'll go now to the more fraud side of things. Just like to remind you that we have a Q&A section at the end. We already have a few very interesting questions around AI, just as a reminder, so don't hesitate to ask more questions. But we now go to the more fraud side of things and look at some examples of use case that some of you might actually experience that actually attend the webinar, have been participating to. So Kris, I'll hand it over to you to present this part of the webinar.
Thanks, Maarten. So I wanted to try and come up with something which wasn't too technical, but remained interesting at the same time. So I'd like to look at a scheme which has a number of solutions to it, although fewer in the Netherlands, according to what Fredrik just mentioned, including enhanced KYC solutions as well. So it relates to the fulfillment of a rollback, which is where a user would commit fraud despite closing the loop on the deposit. Closing the loop or a rollback is where the original value of the deposit needs to be withdrawn back to the account of origin, so back to the account that originally made that deposit before funds can be withdrawn to a secondary account. So In this particular case, the fraudster would use stolen card details that they might have taken from the dark web, for example, and deposit as large a sum as possible, and then use these funds to place bets with massively favorable odds, which they're very likely to win. And they'd split this across a number of different bets. Then they'd withdraw the original value back to the account of origin, and then withdraw the profits from their bets to another account. It's almost risk-free for them, because if they lose their bets, then they can just burn the account and move on to the next one. We actually dived into this exact case in a podcast in one of Sumsub's What the Fraud podcasts about 2 weeks ago, I think. So if any of you want to listen back to that, then search for What the Fraud and look for, I think it was Uncovering the Latest Fraud Tactics in iGaming. So yeah, back to you, Maarten.
No, thanks. I mean, the question is, I think this is I would say, relatively well-known way of trying to commit fraud, but how is it possible that we know about this and that you can describe it and it's fairly recognizable? But how is it possible that these types of schemes still exist in 2024?
I mean, I think one of the I'll let the others answer this, but I think just from my perspective, quickly, I think one of the factors we need to consider is that you asked a moment ago, how do we balance the user experience with the safety aspect and making sure that you really know who your customer is? I think that backfires in some cases, right? Because some operators will try to facilitate that onboarding experience. In some cases, I think without even realizing what Eleni said at the beginning of this webinar in regards to you're actually building trust by having a more enhanced KYC process in place. But they try and make that incredibly easy to the point where it backfires and things like this can happen.
Eleni, you care to comment on Kris's remarks?
I think I'm completely covered, to be honest.
Fred, I mean, from your perspective, I mean, I'm sure at least you're on the threat of fraud as well. Is this something you recognize, and how do you deal with it?
Maybe not the specific issue, because we are, at least in Europe, you are sort of blessed with certain regulations that sometimes are helpful. 3DS or strong customer authentication on card deposits, for example. So it makes it more difficult to use stolen cards. Of course, it's still possible with phishing and whatnot, but I think how is it still possible?
I guess just to interject, Fredrik, to add a further use case, it may be the case that obviously the card holder doesn't know that the card has been stolen. In this case, if it's on a list, typically these lists are advertised with a certain degree of confidence or an accuracy of like 60–70%, depending on how much you're willing to bid for them. And secondly, if there's a way that the user could create an account on the operator's website in the same name as the card holder, then that would presumably facilitate the process as well, right?
Yeah, it's just you would still need to have authentication of the card deposit attempts, at least in most of the European markets. But maybe in the US and others, it's probably a bigger issue. But I mean, you're always going to have this maybe a more like fundamental question, right? It's like how much the user experience are you sort of willing to sacrifice in order to prevent, let's say, something like this from happening? Like what is the cost? What genuine customers are you going to harm by setting up, let's say, stronger verification? But to me, I think like we know that people can get around these things, and it doesn't have to be a card. It could be any payment method for that matter. Like you can get access to a fully verified account and the payment method if you really want to, and you can do a lot of things with it. I think what you need to do is with fraud, ideally, the KYC element is a hurdle. Like there's always going to be ways to get around it, but it can be a hurdle, and it makes it more complicated, more expensive for a fraudster to engage in any kind of activity. Like there's an investment that needs to happen. But then if they do get around it, you are ultimately going to have to look at the actual activity on the site, either whether it's, let's say, multiple accounting or controlling a lot of accounts, or the actual gameplay. You're going to have to be able to detect, let's say, problematic behavior.
Yeah.
To use that phrase.
Maarten, I think it's interesting because we can look at these topics from a very high level, but then I think we have to tiptoe around the subject so that we don't accidentally publicly give something away
I appreciate that. But I think also I think it's good to hear that some of the more strict rules are helpful in this context to help prevent fraud. I mean, the AML rules in Europe, and as well as the financial services rules, are there. And they can be seen to be strict, but I think it's good to know, and it's helpful that they make fraud, in essence, more difficult and more expensive, and therefore maybe less likely to happen than in some of the other jurisdictions. So I think that let's leave it here, and we'll move on to the next topic, which is more about technological solutions and KYC. I think we shortly touched upon AI already before. We have regulations that drives certain differences, certain developments. We have technology, including AI. I think this session would be good to talk a bit about what the trends are and where the solutions might lie. And obviously, as we already discussed before, things have really changed a lot in the last 10, even 5 years. And I mean, just to see what was relevant 10 years ago is not that relevant anymore now. So what technological developments do you see happening, and where do we go from now? Because, as you said, paper identification is something that's of the past, or not of the past yet, but much, much less relevant now.
Yeah.
How do you see this develop?
So let me jump in very quickly again. I think that I kind of want to discuss this so we can remove it from the KYC conversation. I think that in a lot of ways the KYC process is going to become increasingly more dynamic, and there are going to be aspects of it which merge into the transaction monitoring and anti-fraud side of things as well. But just to bring it back to KYC specifically, just a very quick one actually before we do move on. We should bear in mind that 70% of fraud occurs subsequent to the onboarding process. And at Sumsub, we're actually going to be hosting an open demo session on Tuesday, December 3rd, I think, which demos a number of ways that this can be prevented. So it looks at everything after that onboarding process. But yeah, coming back to KYC, I think that AI is also going to prove to be instrumental in how this evolves going forward as well. And I think one of the scarier aspects of that is us making sure that we're in control of how the AI is operating in terms of the decisions it's making and why, and making sure that we have that transparency in place at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's true for not just for KYC and related, but I think that's obviously the case for all aspects of life where AI gets involved. Eleni, Fredrik, are you already looking at AI and following those developments and using it or considering using it for your respective roles?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, we have to keep in mind that these tools are available to the public, and so they are available to fraudsters as well. And so it's kind of our only option to also use the tools as well. We have noticed in the past people trying to use deep fake technology to maybe fool our liveness checks or video verification, or even to forge documents and passports. So since the technology exists, it's kind of a one-way solution for us to use it as well. And to answer your question as well about how many changes have been made since 10 years ago, I would say that while the key KYC principles are still in place, like we still use the same kind of documents for verification, we still rely on government-issued documents, cross-checking customer data against sanctions lists or PEP lists. All that remains the same or remains relevant. But what has changed is the way that we're doing things. The fact that not everything's so manually done. It's not based on manual checks, or we rely heavily on automations now rather than what we used to do like 10 years ago. And I think that's the way forward as well. Like this was sufficient for its time. It's no longer adequate in today's digitally driven world. And since fraudsters have become more sophisticated, we have to also leverage advanced technologies as well.
Okay, thanks, Eleni. Maybe also in view of the time, we thought it would be interesting to have a short a game where we play scammer and operator. And so we'll play that game just as an example of the different practices and how to respond to it. So, Kris, I hand it to you. You're our first scammer of the day. So maybe you start the game.
Yep. So let's start the scamming by creating more than one account. So creating, let's not go as far as all of them, but let's say creating 2 accounts so that I can exploit a bonus. Who's next? Who's after me? Eleni, you go next. You're the operator. You're the responsible one.
I can play the operator. Yeah. So sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah. So just to clarify, the game is going to be that, because I think that we're facing and have been facing for a while an arms race in terms of what the fraudster does and how the operator replies and how the fraudster replies. So I think it might be a fun experiment to start from the beginning. So in this case, I'm the fraudster. I'm creating multiple accounts, and then you'd be the operator. Then Fredrik would be the fraudster, and I'd come back to me being the operator. So how are we going to solve the problem? It feels wrong saying problem from a fraudster's perspective. How are we going to solve the issue of the person directly before us? So if I'm creating multiple accounts, what would you do as an operator to solve this issue?
No, I think it's a good way to view the issue, that you get into their shoes and you try to solve their problems from their perspective. So if you create multiple accounts, then me as an operator have to implement document verification and ask you for documents for all of those accounts, and obviously you're not going to be able to provide them.
Yeah. So now, Fredrik, you've just got 10 of your mates together. You've come up with this genius idea. It's like 2005. You're thinking nothing can stop us, and now they've gone and created document verification. What are you going to do?
I'll open MS Paint. I
love that.
Do some doctoring. I'll send you fake accounts, fake documents.
All right. Okay. Now I've got this. I think I'm the operator now. So I've just got this MS Paint document where somebody's like squiggled their name differently on it. I guess I'm going to speak to my dev team and see what we can do to detect instances where the pixels are obviously askew, and we can identify these document edits.
So then it's back to me as a fraudster, right? So in that case, I can produce fake documents that can pass that analysis, using real templates, using reverse engineering.
Not Paint.
Or Paint.
No.
If I'm talented enough.
Cool. Now you're in the operator shoes, Fredrik.
Yeah, well, I'd probably ask for your ID next to your face, for example. Ooh. It's a lot more difficult to edit. Maybe also today, I feel like I'm back in 2005 now, but I don't think we had liveness checks or something similar. But maybe I would introduce something like that.
I was going to say, I think we've probably evolved up to about 2012 by this point, so a lot of people already have smartphones, so selfies aren't too much of an issue. So I think that puts the onus on me. I'd probably. So did you just say selfie, or did you say liveness as well, Fredrik?
Both, preferably.
Both. Okay. So I'd probably try and see if I can use video loops or something, and just point my phone at a screen to see if that works, and I can pass these checks that way, or load up an image and prepare for it, and then pretend that's my selfie of the person whose name the ID is of, obviously.
And that would put me in a position as an operator to perhaps introduce a liveness prompt on a randomized time. So catch you off guard, ask you to open up your camera, and initiate a call at that stage.
Yeah.
Well, guys, I think I need to interrupt you in your game because otherwise we'll be
Yeah.
on minutes. I think you're getting very enthusiastic about the game.
I was going to say,
I think it shows two sides of your character.
Maarten, if I can interrupt, I think the really interesting thought experiment here is at the point at which we continue just to think about this game beyond where we are now and what the next steps are going to be, because there are going to be more in the future than there have been up to this point. And when we look back on it, the solutions feel so simple, and I just hope that going forward, they're going to be as simple as they have been.
I mean, that's a good conclusion from this section. I think we'll move to the Q&A part of it, because you already had a few very good questions, and they touch upon things that we already discussed. So let's move to the Q&A part and get the audience involved. So the first question from Igor Marishev is in relation to AI, and I think Eleni, you started already referring to it. And his question is, with the rise of AI, what are your thoughts on AI forged documents? Now, people can get an identity card which look absolutely legitimate for only $15, fake selfies, NTF documents to some degree, and pass automated verification. And there's another question around AI and the AI impact, but I think it touches upon something you mentioned, Eleni, already. AI and AI forged documents. How does it impact your attempts or your policies to prevent fraud from taking place?
Yeah, it's an extra check that we have to carry out now with documents. AI is always at the front of our mind, that now that we know that this technology exists and it's widely available. And my thoughts on this topic is that AI is quite good at detecting AI. And so we also have this tool in our toolbox, and I've read somewhere that the best way that teachers have used in the past to detect ChatGPT writing student essays is to ask ChatGPT, like, was this written by AI, and it's very good at recognizing when something's written by AI or not. So I would use the same kind of weapon against the problem.
Yeah, although on the other side, my son is working on his thesis and he's writing it, and he's used ChatGPT to just verify what he's done, but he's also aware that it can be checked. So I think, I see what you mean. At the same time, people continue to develop and also use AI to their advantage. But I thank you very much. I don't know, Fredrik, what is your experience with AI, and how does it impact your company's policies and your work as well?
Well, I think the question was, like, let's say on document forging, right? Like, as an example of a fraud tactic. And one of the things is, I think the fundamental problem really isn't necessarily AI. Get really good at Photoshop too, right? But it's the need for the document at all. So if you're in Sweden, for example, or Denmark, or increasing amount of countries, you have, for example, like bank ID or NEM ID, like you have like national ID schemes, which is widely used, practically frictionless, and it is a proper authentication solution. So in those markets, there isn't any AI. Like, you literally need access to that person's, like, very personal authentication details, right? So there is that. I think for us, AI at the moment, like, as an operator, probably the biggest use case. Look, you will always have like fake documents, but you won't even necessarily need that. What we are also seeing are people stealing or purchasing identities, or getting genuine people to sign up and create and verify genuine accounts, and then they take them over. So this is where you're probably going into, like, there is always, if there is an incentive, there's always going, or an incentive enough, there's always going to be some circumvention. So you ultimately are going to run into the problem of looking at the actual gameplay and the behavior on the site. But finally, just as an operator, I think like the biggest use case right now is probably more in the RG and AML space, where we increasingly need to establish customers' income, their affordability, and that tends to bring a lot of documents, tends to bring a lot of information, can be dozens of pages of bank statements, for example. So just from an operational efficiency perspective, using AI to consolidate the information, pick out the relevant bits so you don't need to spend an hour scrolling through page after page is a use.
Yeah, that's interesting because it ties back to the earlier discussion that we had about KYC being an ongoing process, not something that is just something in the onboarding stuff. And then AI enables you as an operator then to actually make it more easy and more accessible, and also easy to manage as an operator. So very, very interesting take on that as well. I think we have time for one more question, but it's an interesting one as well. It's from Piotr Lisak, who I think I know. How would you view the upcoming duty of liveliness verification of the customer? What is your take on the impact on such verification in the gambling industry? Liveliness verification through electronic means, scanning of the ID document and taking a picture of the face. Maybe Kris, you.
Yeah, sure. I think this ties into the previous question as well. Actually, I think that as AI progresses and as tech progresses in general, we're going to find an increase in non-doc capabilities, so database checks with regulators, with governments and things like this. And I think that that's going to enhance liveness as well, because you're going to have more accurate data upon which, or imagery upon which you're comparing it to. And I think that liveness has so much more scope beyond just KYC. It's something that can be triggered based on a number of different factors, whether it's the behavioral biometrics of the user, in the case that Fredrik just cited, where you might have somebody that opens an account and somebody else takes it over. If you trigger liveness based on a few suspicious patterns of behavior, then that can be triggered at a point later in time, and then you measure how long it takes for the user to interact with that, the IP address that that's coming from. So that's a check that you can do in a very dynamic fashion based on what's going on in the account. So I think that liveness is only going to get stronger. I think that it's going to integrate much more with non-doc. I think it's going to remove the necessity of physical documentation, of fake documentation, which was mentioned in the last question. And I think that it goes beyond KYC. So for me, it's very promising.
I guess, Eleni, from your AML responsibility, that's something you look into as well, or maybe already using. Is that something that you're using at Softswiss?
Yes, we do. We actually use the liveness verification tool option that's offered by Sumsub. So exactly as Kris mentioned.
Okay, and do you measure the effectiveness? Do you measure how many times you actually use it, or is it just an ongoing process that picks up potential anomalies?
No, we don't have statistics for now. It's kind of a new service that we started using, so I don't really have any data to show. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see for sure.
Very interesting, very interesting. So I think we need to wrap up, but thank you very much to this. I mean, there's so many takeaways from this. So if I can just summarize that, I mean, it's obvious also from the last exchange that we had is that KYC is something already not limited to the onboarding process, but it's ongoing in terms of many objectives that actually operators have for KYC. And we talked about fraud, but also safer gambling and all different elements that you use your KYC functions for. Interesting to note that regulation still makes a big difference in what you can and cannot do, and also the requirements potentially make fraud more difficult in certain circumstances. But then, I mean, obviously, the last part, they are AI. There are so many opportunities. It will be an arms race to a certain extent because the opportunities are also there for fraudsters. But at the same time, it also allows operators to do certain checks much quicker, more efficient, and take away some of the more old-fashioned ways of checking identity. So AI clearly will have a big impact based on what we discussed so far. So interesting. Thank you very much for your participation to the speakers. Sumsub will send an email with a recording of the presentation tomorrow at the latest, and I think that will also include the slides that have been shown to you. I thank you all for participating and for your questions. Very interesting, very useful. And please let us know your reactions to the webinar. It was very useful for us. We hope it was useful for you too. And last but not least, thank you for the speakers for your insights, and I hope to speak to you soon again on this really relevant topic. Thank you and have a really good day. Thank you very much.